The thematic of my talk today is on Kant's notion of dignity. And what I will try to do in this brief lecture is to try and locate where, so if you are working on Kant and you are working on the notion of dignity in Kant, which text would you look at and what are the problems involved in the section where Kant speaks of dignity and how do we go about dealing with that. So that is primarily the objective of my lecture here. I'm also heavily relying on my own work on Kant, Nietzsche and Sartre on autonomy. So I'll couple some of them along with the talk on dignity. Why is Kant important as far as the notion of dignity is concerned? To put it very simply, any contemporary discourse on the notion of dignity has to begin with Kant, because along with the notion of autonomy, Kant is taken to be the inventor, discoverer of this peculiar concept of the idea of dignity in contemporary literature. However, Kant's idea of dignity itself is not emerging in a vacuum. Kant has been influenced primarily in his notion of dignity by two strands of thought. One, the Greek way of thinking, and more significantly the Stoic way of looking at the notion of dignity, and in particular Cicero. Cicero's text on obligation is in fact the first text in the history of ideas where the term dignity, dignitas, is used for the first time. And therefore Kant, being a very well-read, thorough scholar, was very aware of this lineage of the notion of dignity as prominent in the Stoics and the ancient Greeks. So that is one strand of thought that Kant picks up. The other strand of thought that influences Kant's notion of dignity is obviously his contemporary times, primarily the writings of the humanist philosophers of the Renaissance period, as well as the slightly senior thinker Rousseau, whose discourse on equality had a huge impact on Kant, as we all know. So that is in broad the lineage of Kant's notion of dignity, and we will look at what peculiar strands of influences Kant picks up from the Stoics and what peculiar aspects does he pick from his contemporary work. So these are the two broad lineages that we will look at in the course of time. Whatever I am saying is substantiated in terms of the handouts that have been given to you, and therefore I will simply direct your attention to those relevant sections. In this particular handout, I have primarily used the groundworks of Metaphysics of Morals, which was a work published in 1785 by Kant. Another work which is also sounding very similar and identical but completely distinct and different is Metaphysics of Morals, which is a much later work written in 1797. The third work which is of some importance to us is Reason Within the Bounds of Bare Reason Alone. This is a later work published in 1785. Then of course the Critique of Practical Reason, 1788, and of course the Critique of Pure Reason, which is 1781, second edition in 87. So these are primarily the major corpus where Kant talks of dignity, or works which relate to the notion of dignity. Apart from these, of course, there are two other essays. One is often translated as Lecture on Pedagogy, or also sometimes on Education, where he does speak of dignity as well, and the other very briefly in what is now published as Lecture on Ethics. So these are the main Kantian corpus where we could locate Kant talking about the notion of dignity. Now, having said this, and having acknowledged that in contemporary times Kant is taken to be the father figure for the notion of dignity, the question that emerges for us as researchers is what is the contemporary debate pertaining to this notion. Now, by and large, there are two broad positions pertaining to the notion of dignity in Kant. One position upholds what I have called, or what I term as the dignity as an ontological property or an ontological value. So, according to this position, Kant upholds that dignity is a property of the self. And it is this property that will ultimately ground all possible moral discourse. So therefore, if you want to talk of morality within the Kantian paradigm, this discourse of morality has to cardinally hinge itself upon this ontological property called dignity. So this is position number one. This is by and large the position that is held by almost majority of the contemporary Kantian scholars who uphold dignity as an ontological property of the self, by virtue of which all moral discourse is grounded. Now, when we say that all moral discourse is grounded, we must immediately bear in mind that it's not only about moral discourse in a vacuum. What is primarily entailed is therefore that any talk about the relationship between the self and the other is therefore cardinally hinged upon this particular ontological property called dignity. So this is one position which is the dominant trend in the present day scenario on the top of dignity. One clear-cut example is the Human Rights Declaration, the UN Declaration of Human Rights, which treats dignity as an ontological property of the self. Of course, it is vague in its outline, but it has to be vague because it has to incorporate the whole world, right? All the different countries with all the different agendas. So therefore, it's slightly vague, but we can discern that what they uphold is an ontological property position. The alternative position, which is slightly not in vogue in the present time, is to uphold what I call dignity as an ontological label of the description of a state of being. So in this case, dignity does not refer to an ontological property of the self, but is rather a label to characterize or mark a state of being. So in which case it becomes a descriptive label and not a predicative label. Right? Of course, please do not take this too further, because then of course every description is ultimately predicated, right? Russell has already shown that to us. But that's not what we mean here. One is describing something and another is actually locating it as a property within the self. So that is the broad lineages of reading. So these are the two readings that we have as far as dignity in Kant is concerned. Now, my position is in alliance with the second reading, where I take Kant to treat dignity as a descriptive level of a state of being rather than an ontological property. Right? So what I will do now is we will briefly look at Kant's formulation of dignity and how he does that. Now, in the first position, which is position of dignity as an ontological property or a value, dignity is therefore an inner intrinsic value by virtue of which the demand to respect others is grounded. That is to say, you must respect the other because the other has dignity, right? Because every self is marked by this predicate of dignity. Therefore, by virtue as a bearer of this mark, it demands that I respect any being that has this predicate of dignity, right? This is in brief formulation the first position of an ontological understanding. Now, in this case, therefore, dignity directly leads to the postulation of a moral law. So, by virtue of you bearing the mark of the predicate of dignity, it will immediately entail a series of moral laws of what I owe to you as a duty. The moment I owe to you something as a duty, this as a corollary entails that you have certain rights which you can legitimately demand from my end. Therefore, the first position, which is the position of ontological predicate, is largely a reading which is favored by any rights-based discourse. So if it is a discourse that harps upon rights primarily rather than duties, then one would uphold Kant's notion of dignity as an ontological predicate. Right? Now, of course, we must here recognize that the same passages are interpreted in two different ways by these two strands of thought. So it's not that there are certain passages where Kant treats it as value and certain passages where he treats it as a descriptive mark. It's the same passages but interpreted differently in different ways. Now, in the second position, which is the position that I uphold, dignity is a descriptive mark, as I have just stated. Now, the point is this, that if it is a descriptive mark, then what does it describe? Is the immediate question that emerges. So, what does this label of dignity describe to us? Now, within the Kant, I will not say within Kantian tradition, but within Kant's work, one can discern this idea that by the notion of dignity, Kant intends to describe the state which he also describes as autonomy. Which is to say that dignity is in a very cardinal way related to the notion of autonomy. Right? We must be careful here that we do not confuse autonomy with freedom. Right? Autonomy is a description of a state that enables freedom. Right? So therefore, autonomy itself is a descriptive term rather than a predicative term. So when we say that I am an autonomous being, within Kant's discourse, it is not to say that I have a property called autonomy which is vested in myself. Rather, it is a description of the nature of the being that I am, right? Which is autonomy. That is the first thing that we must bear in mind. Now, if it is a description, the first question that we answered was this, that what does it describe? So it describes the state of being which can also be described as being autonomous. The second question that then therefore emerges is, why do we need this description? What does this description do within the Kantian corpus? Now the answer to that question appears to me to be this, that within the Kantian corpus, the description of a being as autonomous or the description of a being as having dignity, having in quote unquote, as being described as having dignity, provides the function of locating the self within the gamut of beings. So if we conceive existence as a continuum of beings, right, where does human beings locate themselves within this spectrum? Right? And this description of human beings as autonomous, as possessing dignity, as bearing dignity, immediately enables us, according to Kant, to place ourselves within this spectrum, right? Within the spectrum of being. So this is what now brings me to the lineage that we just spoke of in the beginning. So let's first look at the ancient lineage that Kant has in mind. Now, one of the handouts that I've given to you is of course from Cicero's De Officiis, which is often translated as on obligation or on duty, right? The translation that I am using is by Walter Miller. And in chapter 30 of book 1, if you look at the second paragraph of page number 107 of your handout, you will see that Cicero remarks, "It is essential to every inquiry about duty that we keep before our eyes how far superior man is by nature to cattle and other beasts. They have no thought except for sensual pleasure, and this they are impelled by every instinct to seek. But man's mind is nurtured by study and meditation. He is always either investigating or doing. And he is captivated by the pleasure of seeing and hearing. Even if a man is more than ordinarily inclined to sensual pleasure, provided of course that he be not quite on a level with the beasts of the field, for some people are men only in name, not in fact. If I say he is a little too susceptible to the attractions of pleasure, he hides the fact, however much he may be caught in its toils, and for the very same conceals his appetite. From this we see that sensual pleasure is quite unworthy of the dignity of man. This is the first occurrence of the term dignity in philosophical discourse. Right? Of course, Roman legislators used a similar notion of dignitaries, right? Ministers as dignitaries, right? Which indicates a certain hierarchy, a certain place, a certain rank, a certain position. Of course, Cicero is picking that up from there, but is giving it a very philosophical twist by saying that from this we see that sensual pleasure is quite unworthy of the dignity of man, and that we ought to despise it and cast it from us. But if someone should be found who sets some value upon sensual gratification, he must be kept strictly within the limits of moderate indulgence, so on and so forth. Now, of course, this is just to indicate to my student friends here and my scholar friends here that if you would like to read further, then of course you can take this section and go on further. But what is of importance to us is, if you look at the way that Cicero is placing the notion of dignity, he is evidently, very clearly and also explicitly using the notion of dignity to place human beings as a being amongst the spectrum of being. So he is saying that certain things are not worthy of man. It's below one's dignity. That is to say that we are at a higher level. There is something higher for us to aspire than merely sensual pleasure. So this immediately entails that dignity can be used as a description to position ourselves within a hierarchy of beings. So, and Cicero is picking this up precisely from the Greek tradition, right? Because in the Greek tradition we are all very familiar how rationality is taken to be the mark that characterizes our place within the entire spectrum of existence. And Cicero is picking that up from there. Now, this is what Kant is picking up from Cicero. Now, for me to be saying it so confidently that Kant picks this up from Cicero, we can now look at the set of selections that I have provided to you. Of course, we do not have the time to read the entire thing, but just to give you a kind of a taste of it. It's page 7, page 6 and 7, page number 6 and 7. It's titled Selection A, and this is of course from Religion Within the Bounds of Fair. So in this late work published in 1785, if you read through the first few passages itself, it's evident that Kant is talking about the Stoics. He explicitly mentions Cicero, and he marks both the agreement as well as the difference. So in the first part of the text is where Kant differs from the Stoics, right? So in the second paragraph is the difference that Kant holds with the Stoic position. Those valiant men, that is the men, the Greeks, the Stoics, did however fail to recognize their enemy. Here the enemy is enemy of morality, who is not to be sought in the natural inclinations, which merely lack discipline, but which without disguise exhibit themselves openly to everyone's consciousness. But is, as it were, an invisible enemy who hides behind reason and therefore is all the more dangerous. They enlisted wisdom instead against folly, which through mere carelessness, allows itself to be deluded by inclinations instead of summoning against malice, which covertly undermines one's attitude with soul-corrupting principles. Natural inclinations considered in themselves are good. This is Kant's position, right, as against the Stoics. And it is irrepressible, because the Stoics believe that it could be repressed. So Kant is not in agreement with this positioning of passions as far as the Stoics are concerned. Now, irrepressible. Where? Where? Example, irreprehensible, and not only is it futile, no, that is actually, basically the contention of disagreement is that, because as we know that Kant's position on passions, as he outlines it in the first 4 theorems of the Critique of Practical Reason, is not to say that they have to be suppressed. Right? Because according to Kant, these inclinations by and large have nothing to do with morality. Morality is a completely different ballgame altogether, right? Because morality for Kant emerges from a different faculty, and that's the faculty of pure reason, right? And therefore, in the first 4 theorems of the Critique of Practical Reason, Kant will try to show why any moral theory that bases itself on passions and emotions is doomed to fail, right? So that's where Kant will disagree with the Stoics. Right? So, basically arguing that you took passions to be your primary enemy of morality, but unfortunately that is not the real enemy. Right? So that is Kant's disagreement. But interesting is the agreement that Kant has with the Stoics. And this agreement emerges in the remark, which is in the next page. Right? In page number 7, this is a remark which is there in the text itself. Right? These philosophers, which of course entails the Stoics and the Greeks, took their universal moral principle from the dignity of human nature. Now that's very interesting. Took their universal moral principle from the dignity of human nature, from freedom, as independence from the powers of the inclination, nor could they have laid at the basis a better and nobler one. So Kant is in agreement. Of course, this is, please note that this is Kant's interpretation of the Stoics. Whether the Stoics would completely agree with Kant's reading of their text is highly problematic. It is debatable, right? Because how far this freedom is the freedom that Kant conceives it as is a problematic notion when we compare it with the Stoics. The moral laws that they now drew directly from reason, which in this way was legislative alone, was commanding through these laws absolutely, and thus everything was stated quite correctly, objectively, as concerns the rule, and also subjectively as regards the incentive, if one attributes to human being an uncorrupted will to admit this law unhesitatingly to his maxims. Now, of course, this is Kant's way of understanding the Stoics as what precisely are they saying. So Kant is agreeing with the Stoics and the Greeks insofar as the role of dignity is cardinally related to the role to the notion of morality, right? And he is also seen to be reading into the Stoics this facet that morality must ultimately emerge or ground itself in the notion of dignity, right? So this seems to be, of course, a Kantian reading of the Stoics. However, where the Stoics would not agree with Kant is Kant's emphasis on his idea of freedom. Because the Kantian idea of freedom is obviously not the idea of freedom that the Stoics have in mind. What, of course, is an agreement is that the notion of dignity, therefore, singles human beings out in their capacity to be described as having dignity. Whereas other animals don't have dignity. And of course, this is a standard critique against Kant, because in his lecture on ethics, Kant states that animals are only means and they are not ends in itself. The only ends in themselves are human beings, and therefore the only creatures which can be described as having dignity are human beings. So of course there is a standard critique against Kant on that. But here I believe that the influence of Kant's contemporaries And primarily, the medieval Christian thinking enters into this Kantian thought strand. Because it is there that we find the cardinality of freedom. Now, of course, unfortunately, I have not come across many works of this period which has been translated in English. But one notable work, which is a very interesting work, is by this Italian thinker, Mirandola, which is titled and is translated in English as Oration, or sometimes also translated as Discourse on the Dignity of Man. Now, in this text, Mirandola basically argues that human beings are peculiar precisely because human beings are the only beings that have the freedom to choose their place in the spectrum of beings. In other words, in God's creation, of course this is highly influenced by Christian theology, but the idea is this, that when God created the world, He placed all beings in singular places, places which cannot be exchanged. So particular nature of being was infused into them, and a particular position was granted to them in the hierarchy of beings. Human beings are peculiar precisely because human beings have the freedom to decide where precisely they want to place themselves in this spectrum. So, of course, in Mirandola's work, the two ends, the two nodes of the spectrum is God at the one end and beasts on the other, right? So, in the spectrum of beasts and man and God, man has the freedom to choose where to place himself or herself, right? And it is this capability to choose one's own positioning that Mirandola labels as dignity. Now, this seems to be a strand of thought that has influenced Kant, right? And Kant seems to pick this up because here, unlike the idea of reason, freedom is cardinal, right? In the Greek tradition, we are peculiar because we are rational. That's the, of course, we are rational, therefore we are free as well, right? But in the writings of Mirandola, and of course also on we can read a similar notion of thought also in Augustine. The idea is this, that first and foremost we are free, right? So freedom becomes the cardinal mark of you being a man, being human beings, right? So Kant now, what I see is the beauty of Kant is, Kant now manages to merge these two marks, rationality on the one hand and dignity on the other, that is rationality and freedom on the other, and combines them together to give us a new idea of what is dignity. Dignity as autonomy, right? And to support this reading, we can of course now look at this selection, which is on the first page itself, that is selection 1, which is from the groundwork of metaphysics of moral. Right? And if just to cut things short, if you just look at page number 2, this is the ending section of section 436 of the academic edition. You cannot find anything more explicitly stated than what Kant has to say in his own words. Autonomy is therefore the ground of the dignity of human nature and of every rational nature. Right? So that the relationship between autonomy, dignity and rationality is cardinal in Kant is very explicit. Right? Now, the effort is to decipher precisely what is the nature of this relationship, right? And that's where most of the debates are. So why do we say that in the alternative reading, why are we hesitant to ascribe value, dignity as an ontological value? Now, primarily scholars who argue for the second position emphasize the third passage that I have quoted in page number 1. Now there Kant writes, in the kingdom of ends, everything has either a price or a dignity. Now, therefore, Kant operates with the dichotomy of an entity having a being having a price and a being having dignity. So this is the dichotomy that Kant has set up. What has a price can be replaced. Right? So it is substitutable by something else as its equivalent. What on the other hand is raised, again the idea of raised once again gives us the idea of a position, right? Of where we stand. So therefore a descriptive stance. On the other hand, what is raised above all price and therefore admits of no equivalent has a dignity. So this basically entails that dignity is in the continental sense of the term a singular description. It cannot be replaced, it cannot be substituted, right, by anything other than dignity itself. So you do not have in Moore's term, in that sense of the term, it is indefinable in terms of anything other than itself. Right? So you would possibly not be able to replace it. What is related to human inclinations and needs has a market price, which is to say that it has a value. Right? Of course, this is, as I have already stated, much more explicitly discussed in the four theorems in the first part of the Critique of Practical Reason. And that which, even without presupposing a need, conforms with a certain taste, that is with delight, is the mere purposelessness, play of our mental powers, has a fancy price. But that which constitutes the condition under which alone something can be an end in itself, and not merely a relative word, that is a price, but an inner word, that is dignity. So here Kant is very lucid in telling us what dignity actually is. So dignity is that which is the ground for all other values, right? For all other values. So this seems to be the Kantian positioning of the notion of dignity. Now, of course, in the remaining of the section, Kant does talk about how the notion of autonomy and freedom is related with the notion of dignity. So, since there's not much time, so I'll just quickly go through what these particular selections will direct us towards, and then try to sum up whatever it is that I'm trying to say. So I will leave selection 2 for the minute and go to selection 3. Selection 2 and 3 is important because it tells us how causality is cardinal to Kant's notion of freedom and autonomy. Right? So that's why those selections are there. But I would like to draw your attention to Kant's later work, much later work, Metaphysics of Morals, which many scholars hold to be the practical aspect of the critique of practical reason. Right? Of how are we to employ the critique of practical reason, and therefore Kant's Metaphysics of Morals, published in 1797. Now in selection 4, there's a very interesting term that is happening. Now I will not read it because it's there very clearly, you can read it for yourself. What is evident is that for Kant, the primary fallout of dignity, to uphold the notion of dignity, is to uphold the notion of a duty, is not to uphold the notion of a right. Dignity does not directly entail right. For Kant, dignity directly entails a duty. This is one. 2, this passage will clearly show us that this duty is not towards the other. It's a duty to oneself. Right? But now, since we are talking within the spectrum of kingdom of ends, a duty to myself translates as a duty to everyone. Right? So in this sense, there is a very thin line between duty to oneself and duty to the others, because what is of duty to one is, as a rule, a duty for everyone. Right? Because we are talking about the hypothetical case of the kingdom of ends. Now this is what does not fit with right-based discourse, which tries to appropriate Kant and the notion of autonomy and dignity to argue for rights. Right? Of course, this does not mean that Kant is not talking of rights. Of course he does. That Kant is not talking towards duty for others. Of course he does. Right? But all of this is primarily grounded, first and foremost, in duty to oneself. Right? So, and therefore it is a duty-based notion of dignity. It is a self-centered notion of dignity, first and foremost. Right? And therefore, in the second section, in fact, I've given the whole title of that section itself. This section is titled "On Duties of Virtue Towards Other Human Beings Arising from the Respect Due to Them." That "to" is missing, the "due to them," right? Which basically means by virtue of every rational being as characterized as having dignity, what are the duties that we owe towards them? So, of course, Kant has an entire section on what are the duties that we owe to them. But first and foremost, the emphasis is on the notion that the bearer of this mark of dignity, first and foremost, owes duty to oneself and duty to others. Right? It is this duty that then can be translated as a right, as a demand. So in Kant, once again, the distinction between a duty and a right is very, very thin, right? Depending on which side of the position that you are coming from. So, now coming to the last point that I intended to highlight was this, that when we talk of Kantian rationality of course we all know that it is categorical, right? As far as pure reason in its practical aspect is concerned, is categorical. Now the interesting thing that emerges once we agree with this fact that it is categorical is this, that it is not calculated. It is not calculated. Now this is very, very important, because this is where I feel Nietzsche's reading of Kant falters, because Nietzsche clearly reads Kantian rationality as calculated rationality. But if it is categorical, Kant's point is precisely this, that if it is categorical, it cannot be calculated, because it is prior to all calculations. It serves towards that end, no ends other than itself. And that's in a particular sense why it is a categorical imperative. Now, if it is not calculated in the sense that it can calculate means towards an end or mean geared towards an end, the interesting question is, what kind of rationality are we talking about here then? Right? Then what is the notion of autonomy? Now, by and large, I think it is very, very useful for us to note that Kantian idea of freedom primarily emerges in his critique of pure reason rather than the critique of practical reason. The critique of practical reason, as Kant in one of his letters to his friends writes, is a fallout of an insight that he got in the critique of pure reason. So Kant was very excited, as we know now from his correspondence, after completing he could not wait to complete the critique of pure reason, because he immediately wanted to sit down to work for the critique of practical reason. Right? And scholars have been debating as to what was this insight, and by and large now there is a sort of an agreement that the insight that he got is precisely in the third antinomy of reason, which is what I have provided you as the third angle. Right? It is here that Kant talks of autonomy and freedom for the first time, right? in his corpus of the Critiques. Now what is interesting here is that it outlines freedom as a causality. Right? So freedom is a cause, but it's a peculiar cause. because it is a cause that is only intelligible. So it's not, you cannot treat freedom as a cause of the empirical variety, which in itself will demand another cause. Right? That's the antinomy of reason. So Kant's solution to the antinomy, to this antinomy, the third antinomy of reason, is precisely to argue that we were mistaken in thinking that there is only one kind of causality. Of course, this reading, which is largely propagated by French scholars of Kant, is also called as the double aspect theory of Kant's freedom. Right? Where Kant, it's held that Kant is arguing, and this text, this particular selection proves this to quite a significant degree, that Kant believes that we can understand the notion of causality in two different ways. We can understand causality as what Kant himself calls empirical causality, which is causality that operates within the realm of the phenomenon, which can be known. Right? So I know that fire is the cause of smoke. Right? Now, in this cause of knowing this cause, that is fire, as the cause of smoke, I am in a legitimate possession of knowledge pertaining to the phenomenon. However, Kant's point is, I can also understand causality not as in this empirical sense, but as a purely transcendental, intelligible idea, right? Which, though makes its presence felt, cannot be known. As we know that in Kant, freedom cannot be known. It can only be, as Kant says, thought through, right? It can only be thought through. This is what Kant will tell us, right? And according to Kant, it is not even important for us to actually know it. It's enough for us to understand, and that's the only thing that you can do because it's only an intelligible cause. Therefore, just the acknowledgement, the realization that such a cause is required is sufficient to establish the legitimacy of upholding this notion of freedom as causality. Now, it is this causality, which is pure causality. Kant, in fact, marks it as spontaneity. Right? You can immediately see it, and this is emphasized in the original itself. In the first selection itself, academic number B474, towards the end of the passage, you see, a causality must be assumed through which something happens without its cause being further determined by another previous cause. That is, an absolute causality, spontaneity beginning from itself, a series of appearances that runs according to natural law. So this idea of freedom as spontaneity is occurring for the first time in the Critique of Pure Reason, which is what then Kant goes on to modify in the Critique of Practical Reason. Right? The interesting, of course, as an aside, it is precisely this spontaneity that Nietzsche will harp upon. Right? And argue that Kant, though characterizes freedom as spontaneity, in the due course of his discourse, he forgets all about this spontaneity. Right? And of course, Nietzschean idea of spontaneity is quite different from Kantian idea of spontaneity. So towards that end, so, in general, this is what Kant seems to be upholding through the notion of dignity. So, what are the key features? The key features, I think, are these: that dignity is first and foremost a duty-related concept. Right? It's a duty-related notion. Two, it is used as a marker of a description of a being to place itself within a range of existence. And therefore, in this sense, dignity is a relational concept. it is a relational concept. So this is one set of things that we have to ponder about if we are thinking about Kant in terms of the notion of dignity. The other aspect which we must really think about when we are thinking of Kant in terms of dignity is the relationship between dignity and morality. Now when we think of dignity and morality, the problem is that it is quite an arduous task to really figure out Kant's own notions of what precisely is the relationship between autonomy and the general discourse of morality. So even that must come into the fold, because primarily the idea of freedom as causality, right, in a very peculiar way, contradicts the very idea of freedom, right? Because if freedom itself is causality, then it leads to a kind of a problematic. And this is why Kant's morality, and therefore as a corollary, Kant's notion of dignity, becomes problematic, because here one can now conclude that Kant seems to be emphasizing dignity and rationality and autonomy and freedom within the paradigm of obedience. Right? So freedom is the freedom to obey. Right? Dignity is the freedom to obey. Right? So when do you showcase dignity? Of course, as we all know, in Kant operates with the Greek idea where there is a distinction between potentiality and actuality, right? We are not actually moral beings. We are not actually autonomous. We are only potentially autonomous. So we have to work towards that potentiality and actualize it, and that's where what constitutes the dignity in us. But if you realize that, then what do you become at the end of the day? So what does dignity, recognition of dignity lead you to? It leads you to a state of obedience. Right? And this seems to be a fairly recognizable theme in Kant, right? But so the last word that I would like to say and then conclude is, however, obedience in Kant is a very interestingly formulated concept, because obedience in Kant is not subjugation, right? Because if obedience is freedom, then freedom contradicts the very notion of subjugation. So obedience can't be subjugation. So this means that Kant comes up with a very peculiar concept of obedience, right? Which I think is of some interest and also of importance in the present day scenario, right? Of trying to understand obedience as something that is not subjugation. So we could perhaps together explore the modality, the Kantian modality of obedience, right? A quick entry into this will be, of course, Kant's work on education, right? On education, where Kant is literally, fighting this battle between how to safeguard autonomy and yet, instill obedience, because children are also human beings, therefore they have autonomy, dignity, so on and so forth. And on the other hand, we need to discipline them. So how do these two go together, right? So you will see that tussle, very interesting tussle, and perhaps we can come up with some interesting and important themes of obedience in time. So thank you very much.